Welcome to Real Life with Belle. Thanks for pressing play. You could be doing 1,000 other things right now, and yet here we are. I don't take that lightly. If you're enjoying the conversations, learning something, or quietly rethinking your life choices, make sure to hit follow or subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you're feeling mildly motivated, leaving a review is a big help. It tells the algorithm this podcast is worth sticking around for. All right, gratitude expressed, let's get on with real life. Welcome to Real Life with Belle. Today I am joined by Associate Professor Geoff Ginn, Brisbane-based historian and author who teaches history at UQ. Geoff is known for his work on Queensland's cultural and religious history, especially colonial Brisbane and 19th century heritage. Geoff has dedicated his work to uncovering the hidden gems of our city's past, from the everyday lives of early residents to the surprising stories behind some of our most iconic places. In this episode, we'll chat about Brisbane's evolving identity, a journey through the Brisbane you thought you knew. Welcome, Geoff.
Thank you, Belle. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here today. Now, for listeners unfamiliar with your work, tell me a little bit about yourself and why you chose Brisbane's history.
I just feel blessed every day doing a job that I love. I've always been interested in history as a kid. Enjoyed history at school, went to university, did a Bachelor of Arts degree, which is one of the best things you can do. Decided that history was my thing, did honours in history, travelled overseas for a bit. Then when I came back, I started a PhD. I had a scholarship to do that. So being able to just follow through, jump on a conveyor belt and just keep going and see where it takes you was just a pretty simple life choice for me.
Did you always love modern or ancient?
Always loved modern,
Yep.
Partly because I'm not great at maths and I don't do the backwards counting very well with the centuries. You know how it's 3rd century BC, 4th century BC. Much happier in the modern period.
Embarrassingly,
Yeah.
centuries are difficult for me as well.
Yeah. So the whole thing about 18th, 19th, 20th century, the dates are different, but you work it out. So I've always much more focused on modern history, and that's partly because I can see how the impact of the past is around us all the time. And I personally think the developments of the 19th century are really key. The 20th century is obviously, very large in people's experience, the World War, the 2 World Wars, migration, all the sort of modern changes. But so much of that is established in the 19th century. So I've really got a sense of the 19th century as a foundation of the modern world. And because I like art history and music and culture and poetry and literature, you find you can study anything in a historical context. You can study the history of people's ideas. You can study the history of how they related to each other, social relationships, social institutions. And so I did a PhD thesis on urban reform, urban policy in 19th century London. 19th century London's a fascinating city. And when there's massive inequalities, there's an enormous difference between wealth and poverty, and trying to think, well, how did people come to terms with that? What did they do about it? So I was sort of intrigued by the 19th century, by British culture at the time, but also by the challenges that were faced with a modern city like London at the end of the 19th century. So having worked on that kind of topic, I was working on my PhD, the scholarship runs out, and I stared working as a heritage consultant.
That was when you were living overseas?
No, I was overseas as a student and then came back to finish the thesis back here. And when the scholarship runs out, you need to find a part-time job to finish the thesis. And I was very fortunate that a local cultural heritage consultancy was looking for a historical researcher. So I started working with archaeologists when I was about 25, 26, and a bit older than that, 27 probably. And the experience of working with archaeologists doing local history projects really just opened up my eyes to the whole history around us. And the fact that archaeologists are very good at digging holes, but they often need a bit of advice about the historical context of what they're digging up. And that meant as a historian, you could come onto those project teams, you could work with engineers and architects and people doing different aspects of a project.
And these projects, where were these digs?
A lot of them are in Brisbane.
Wow.
Like in the end, I think I probably did 4 or 5 different excavations in central Brisbane.
What did we find in any of those? Just your favourite?
Yeah,
what did we find?
Well, I guess the very first one I did was as the historian on the convict lumberyard site, and that was where Queen Street meets North Quay.
Okay.
The old Prudential building, which was there, was demolished in the 1990s. And because that building didn't have any foundations, it didn't have a basement, it just had a concrete slab poured on the ground. When they demolished that building, they realised that anything that was there before the 1950s would still be there. So there was an excavation on that site.
Like private company?
Well, it was funded by the Brisbane City Council,
Got it.
but it was the work was undertaken by a private company, the company I
So
worked
whatever's
for.
found, council own?
Whatever is found is treated as a cultural heritage material, and it's either conserved or a decision is made to dispose of it. And if it's conserved, it usually goes to a museum. So in this case, it went to the Queensland Museum.
What was it?
Yeah. Well, it was a bunch of material from the convict settlement, so we actually uncovered the foundations of a carpenter's building and a convict lumberyard in that corner of the convict settlement. And it was the foundations of the building that was there, built in the early 1830s and then demolished in the 1840s, semi-demolished, because at that stage there was no resources around. And so they reused the building stone and the bricks to build another series of premises on the site. So there was a shoe shop there in the 1840s and 1850s. So we found the foundations of the convict structure, which was then used as the foundations for one of the first shops in Brisbane. And it was really like it was the foundation stones. As you excavate it, essentially you're finding the footprint of the original buildings, but then you're finding material in amongst that. So there's pipes and there's glassware and there's broken ceramics and there's a lot of the everyday things of everyday life. But being the historian means you've got to do the research and try and put all that into context.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's what took me from the world of British history into the world of applied history, local history in our region. So that company that I worked for 5 years, we ended up doing work all over Queensland. We did excavations in Brisbane, but we also did a lot of impact assessments and conservation studies, oral history work for native title claims. It was great. It was 5 years of traveling all around the state and doing all these different projects. It was wonderful.
Sounds fun. That actually sounds really interesting. I would love to go on a dig and be there when they find something, like just even, like you say, whether it's cutlery or ceramics.
Yeah, it's the everyday life. Yeah.
Coins would have been good.
Yeah.
Jewels, gold.
One of the other ones we did was the Petrie Barracks, the police barracks on Petrie Terrace.
Yeah.
When they were redeveloping that site for the cinema and shops that are there now, they originally thought that the maps they were using were poorly scaled, and so they couldn't work out the size of the original prison that was there. So the early Brisbane jail was there before the convict barracks were built.
Yeah.
And so the whole before the police barracks were built. So
then I believe it was an underground nightclub.
Yes,
did you
that's
ever
right.
go to the underground?
No, I don't remember what was there. Yeah, I remember when it was there. Yeah. But there were structures like that people just don't know the extent of them until you do the detailed research.
And did you say they did a dig there?
They did an initial investigation, and the company that I was working with at the time was doing that predictive modelling and then doing initial trenches in order to then identify the extent of the site. And they sort of thought that it was a bigger site, i.e. across the whole hilltop. But the research that we did and the fieldwork, the initial trenching that we did demonstrated that the entire early prison was right there on the within the footprint of the later barracks. So that complicates the whole redevelopment process a lot more. And then another company did the final excavation and all the detailed work.
And there were things found there too?
Yeah, that's right. Tom Blake was the historian for that, and he's a very good Queensland historian.
Wow.
So, yeah.
That is fascinating. So, in your opinion, how has Brisbane changed? So if we're talking colonial Brisbane, and then we're talking when you were a child, and then to now, what's your opinion on the change?
Well, Brisbane, like many cities, is a global city now, and it's also a phenomenon, a city that's come about as a result of a series of things that have occurred in Australian society and in global society, really. So the fact that we've got an enormous landmass, the fact that it's a very suburban city, with a CBD that goes back to the 19th century, but with cities, suburbs that developed in the decades after that, to the end of the 19th century.
What year in the 19th century?
Well, Brisbane as a settlement begins in the 1820s. 1824 is the date. 1824 is the date at Redcliffe, and then 1825 is the date that they moved the settlement up from Redcliffe to Brisbane, what is now the CBD.
So we've got 1788 when the Europeans arrive and colonise, and then we've got what?
Sydney.
So then we've got what? 30 years.
Yeah. And at that point, there's different outposts of that convict administration in Sydney. And one of the questions they were dealing with at the start of the 1820s, there was in fact a Royal Commission into this, was whether the convict settlements were scary enough anymore, whether they were doing their main job, which is trying to deter people from offending in Britain because of the fear of transportation. Because Sydney was developing to quite a nice town, lovely weather. The word was getting out that it wasn't as ferocious as it should have been. So there was a Royal Commission.
So Europeans arrive. It's a convict settlement. They're building. It becomes a nice retreat.
Well, it's more because of the ticket of leave. The fact that convicts had served their sentence could then get a ticket of leave, could then become free people, citizens, could then buy farms and so on.
But then they were advertising in England.
Well, they were starting to think about migration. They were starting to think about economic development and so on. And in the process, the whole idea of being transported to Botany Bay was no longer as terrifying as it would have been in the 1780s.
Over a 30-year span.
Yeah, so they had to try and work out a way to make sure that transportation still had a deterrent effect. So the solution was, let's make some other places in Australia that are nastier than Sydney.
Are we talking Tasmania?
We're talking Brisbane, Moreton Bay. So this is what they resulted. This was the result. They came up with 3 potential sites for settlement north of Sydney.
Yeah.
A couple further north around Gladstone, Port Curtis, those sorts of areas. But because Brisbane was the closest, or Moreton Bay was the closest, that's why John Oxley was coming up in order to properly chart the Moreton Bay area to work out the source of the Brisbane River, and the fact that there was a river was something that was identified.
And so when was that, when John Oxley?
That was 1823, and he's the Surveyor General of New South Wales. He comes up in order to see, is this a suitable place for a settlement? And he comes up the Brisbane River. He names, Breakfast Creek, for instance, what was now called Oxley Creek. I think he called it Canoe Creek because they found a Aboriginal canoe there. He went up as far as about Goodna. And on his way back, he decided that he thought Breakfast Creek was a good place for settlement. So his recommendation
for Brisbane City,
for the subsequent penal station that would be set up. So when they came up, they arrived at, this is in 1824 now, a fellow called Henry Miller was the commanding officer with a small detachment of Marines and a small detachment of convicts. They arrived at Redcliffe and they were there for a matter of months. They had a convict camp there. And then in early 1825, he decided to move upstream and he went straight past Breakfast Creek. He thought, that didn't take Oxley's advice.
Nothing there.
Yeah. And in fact, this is the interesting thing about Brisbane is the actual date that this occurs and the actual decision that he took about where the settlement should be sited has never really been documented, has never properly been documented. He didn't write about it in his report. He didn't write about it in a diary. It's somewhere in April 1825. So they moved the camp up from Redcliffe to establish a new camp where the CBD is now. And it's because they assumed it was a temporary settlement for the punishment of convicts.
It wasn't a big deal.
It wasn't a big deal, and it wasn't going to be a city. It was establishing a settlement for the purpose of housing the convicts. The idea was that the settlement would be self-sufficient. And so the convicts had to be put to work. They had to build huts. They had to build, structures. They had to cultivate the fields.
And so if it wasn't Brecky Creek, what was it?
Well, that's the choice. He made the decision to go to where the CBD is now, and he arrived where Queen's Wharf is. So that slightly higher north side of the riverbank. And I think it was pretty evident that there was floods on the south side. There was evidence of flood damage that other people at the time had seen. And so the idea of getting a higher riverbank side, I think the view to Mount Cootha, I think the view across South Brisbane towards Mount Cootha is a big part of the story. The reason why he chose that side, it's the high side of the river. It's got a view across to the mountains. And there's also the availability of building stone on Kangaroo Point Cliffs. So they knew from the start they were going to be building huts and accommodation. So it was across the river from where the stone was visible at Kangaroo Point. So I think it's, and also fresh water. So there's fresh water around what is now Gartons Point. So it's a combination of those environmental elements, but fundamentally, I think it's the view to the mountains. I really do. I think the fact that you look across from South Brisbane towards Mount Cootha and it's an outlook.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
So that's where we've settled the convict settlement.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then tell me about now.
Yes. So I both got sidetracked there. So so that whole notion of there being a convict establishment, that was an early research interest of mine. And the fact that you've then got Brisbane developing as a colonial city. And it develops as a colonial city in an era of British colonial, the peak of Britain's colonial presence around the world. So the advent of mass migration to the Australian colonies, in the 1840s and 1850s. So the first free migrants arrive in Brisbane in the late 1840s. The convict settlement was wrapped up in 1842, and it was a period of 6 or 7 years before a major arrivals of people occurred. But at that time there were land sales, and so people were starting to buy blocks of land in North Brisbane, South Brisbane, Kangaroo Point. But what I'm interested in, I think, as a historian, is the way Britain had a global presence. And Britain was a maritime power, the powerful navy, powerful merchant marine. It develops this whole system of assisted migration. So British people, Welsh, Scottish, Irish, English, in their tens and hundreds of thousands eventually are going across the seas to start new lives elsewhere. And the fact that a lot of them go to the US is well known. A lot of them go to New Zealand, a lot of them go to South Africa, and an enormous number come to Australia. My family arrived from Ireland in the 1850s at a time when the population of Brisbane was about 3,000.
And they arrived and settled in Brisbane?
And they went to Ipswich. Because Ipswich was going places in the 1850s.
Well, Ipswich was supposed to be...
Ipswich people will tell you that Ipswich was supposed to be the capital. And they're right. There was a serious consideration about whether this campsite would continue, because Brisbane, had subsequently had convict structures built there, but it was still a pretty modest place. There was barracks and there was accommodation and there were huts.
So we're talking Spring Hill?
This is between what we now think of as North Quay and Spring Hill. So that area of Brisbane with the Queen Street, George Street intersection, where Queen Street meets George Street, that's kind of the epicenter of the original convict township. But like I say, that was wrapped up in 1842. When people like my ancestors arrived in 1853, the population of that little township was about 3,000. Ipswich had a much better prospects at that stage. It was closely connected to the Darling Downs, which is where all the pastoral development was happening, so sheep and later on cattle. And the notion that Ipswich had coal supplies, so it was able to sort of develop as the centre of the coal industry. That was early days, but over the time they could see that the coal was going to be a future. On top of that, it's upstream, and so it's more of a connecting zone between the Darling Downs and the bay, in a way that this little settlement at what we now think of as Brisbane wasn't quite so well situated. It didn't have clear economic prospects. I think that's the best way to say it. But the person who makes the decision to establish the settlement where the current CBD is a veteran of Waterloo, a British, military figure. He's a relatively junior officer, Henry Miller, and there's no, as far as I can see, there's no portrait of him.
Yeah.
But he has a military career and he ends up commanding this convict establishment.
Do you think that was a choice that he made to come across, or would he have been posted?
Oh, he would have been posted. This is part of his military service.
Right.
Yeah. Funnily enough, during the 1974 Brisbane floods, there's that famous story about how a ship got stuck at the Evans Deakin shipyard and it made the flood worse. Have you heard that story?
Oh, no.
So there was a flood in the dry dock. There was a ship in the dry dock at Kangaroo Point in the shipyard being built. And because of the floods, it got swept out of the big boat, big ship, but it got stuck in the bend of the Brisbane River, and it was wedged there during the 1974 flood, and it was holding water back. It was this big unfinished boat. Now it was called the Henry Miller. The name of that boat was the Henry Miller, after this guy who had been the commandant at the original settlement.
How have I never heard that story?
Yeah, it's a funny one. Yeah, it's a funny one. It's one of those things that happens in floods.
How did they move it?
Well, they had to wedge it out eventually when the water, So,
tugboats.
Yeah, the way they do.
Tugboats.
Yeah, the way these people do on the water. Yeah.
Wow.
So that's at a time when there was still an industrial shipyard at Kangaroo Point. They were still making ships. So getting back to the kind of the big colonial picture, because I'm interested in the British world, I'm interested in British history, I'm interested in the way the British colonial world developed. And you realise that places like Brisbane and Queensland are really there's many of them, but they're kind of the epicentre of global changes. There's a historian, Jamie Bellich, who calls this the settler revolution of the 1930s. And it's as big as the Industrial Revolution. It's the fact that from particularly the English-speaking world, tens of thousands and ultimately hundreds of thousands of migrants went out and totally transformed these other societies on the other side of the world. Now, clearly, it's also a process of dispossession of First Nations, Indigenous people, and that's a colonial legacy that we're always dealing with. But it's also a story of how these societies develop as transplanted societies on the other side of the world. And there's pros and cons about that. Yeah. And there's an enormous contemporary significance about that.
Just touching on the First Nations and the British arriving and incidentally what occurred, would it be safe to say that when the British arrived in any of their settlements across the world, was the protocol the same?
No, the protocol wasn't always the same because there was not a clear central policy. And even if there was a clear central policy, they had no means to police it on the far-flung edges of empire. But there were essentially practical military and naval figures involved, and they always looked for practical solutions. And they often had clear instructions about humanitarian practices, and in many cases, a lot of them tried to follow those humanitarian practices. There were others who had no such qualms and were basically going to do what they had to do in order to secure, what they felt they were there to achieve.
Their job.
Yeah. So there's a kind of a pragmatism and there's a hard-headedness associated with that pragmatism, but there's also an awareness in British life about the significant disruptive and ultimately catastrophic impact this was having on Indigenous communities across what we think of as the British Empire. The thing that is in common, though, is this famous legal idea of terra nullius, which develops as a legal principle and is subsequently used in the context of the Mabo decision in Australian law in the 1990s. And that itself comes out of a much older tradition of European law, where there's an assumption that the land is occupied when the land is cultivated and used. And if it's not being cultivated and used, well, nobody occupies it then. So when they say terra nullius, they don't mean that there was literally no one
Nobody
there.
there.
They knew there were people
It's
there.
that they were nomadic.
But they were perceived to be nomadic,
Yeah.
and they were perceived to be not utilising the land for cultivation.
Or aqua.
Yeah.
So what about a fellow, Bruce Pascoe, wrote a book, Dark Emu, which went completely against the terra nullius.
Yes.
And his research did show that the Indigenous of Australia did.
Yeah, that's an interesting, there's a whole debate in the field of archaeology about that. My colleague, Michael Westaway, good friend of mine, is currently working on an ARC linkage project, a series of them, to investigate the dark emu hypothesis and to see, well, what is the evidence in archaeology for this kind of intensive cultivation and for what we think of as settlement?
Yeah.
My issue with that is that there is a connotation associated with the word nomadic as if it's somehow lesser or not substantial. And there's a desire to find evidence for the opposite of that, i.e. settlement. In the archaeological literature, they call it intensification. It's not settlement, i.e. villages, but it's an intensification of land use, which also involves an intensification of the relationship with the land. And so the land is known, it's named, it has stories attached to it, it has ownership attached to it, it has obligations, and it has kind of arrangements that pass from one generation to the next. That's the important part, I think, to emphasize. And I don't think using labels like nomadic or settlement, because they're often pejorative or positive, is really the solution. And so Michael's research is about intensification, because the one thing that can't be denied is the powerful cultural practices associated with the land that's there in Indigenous culture. It's a connection with the land, but it's also the land as an economic resource. It's a land as a spiritual resource. It's such a powerfully rich connection that all we can do is admire it. All we can do is say, well, that's an extraordinary culture.
Yeah.
And what we can do as researchers in the present is do our best to understand it. Ask good questions, ask interesting questions, and to listen respectfully to the voices.
And learn.
And learn. Yeah, exactly. So in some ways, I think Bruce Pascoe has leaned heavily into this idea of, well, we had villages, we had settlements, we had townships too,
Yeah.
And I think in a way that's the contentious part of his argument, which is what makes for a public discussion, which is great. But it's also a question to be explored and investigated and studied.
Yeah. No, I'll be interested to hear the results of the fellow that you're working with that's doing that research now. Yeah. I've read quite a lot of books, historical books, like first person. I can't remember the name of this particular book, but it was first person, and it was a diary of one of the first fleet. And as they were sailing down, I think it was Tasmania, they'd come from South Africa and then down Tasmania, and he was saying what he saw on the shores, and it was
Campfires.
and it was the men
Yep.
that were standing on the waterline with their spears, and they were angry,
Yeah.
and they could see the women at the tree line back at the back of the beach. They were absolutely there.
Oh, yeah.
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 And
it's
not happy to see the shit.
No. And it's a daily reality for the administrators and the officers who run these settlements to deal with it. And in the Brisbane case, there was a clear sign at Redcliffe that the settlement was not welcome. And there was tension between, local Indigenous elders and representatives and the officers there. And there was also difficulty with water supply. It was not considered a kind of a viable long-term spot.
Yeah.
But moving up to what we now think of as the CBD, it was when they started cultivation, and it was when Aboriginal groups started coming and thinking, oh, this is nice, let's have a bit of this corn. And that's when it becomes a property and trespass issue. And so there's clashes on South Brisbane. So there's a series of clashes on South Brisbane within a year or two. Right. That starts to lead to the problem of frontier violence in the Brisbane context.
Right. Well, so were there any, do you know the rules and laws that they were as Brisbane built toward the Indigenous, and how they were able to interact with the Europeans?
Yeah, there's this sort of I think it's on the edge of being an urban myth in Brisbane, but the notion that we have boundary streets. There's a boundary street in Spring Hill, there's a boundary street in West End, and people often say that's where Aboriginal people were forced to go under the curfew. And that's
So beyond
those town boundaries, yeah. And that's true. That's true. It's likely, we don't know for certain, but it's likely that there was an informal policy like that pursued by the police magistrates and so on. Because what we do know is that the enduring campsites and settlements for Indigenous people, for Aboriginal people, was just on the outskirts of that. So York's Hollow, for instance, what we now think of as Victoria Park, that was a very prominent Indigenous campsite. And it's called York's Hollow because the local elder was given the nickname the Duke of York. And so his people were the Duke of York's people in this pocket of land on the other side of Spring Hill. So York's Hollow was a very well-known Aboriginal campsite, and there were documented examples of military activity to clear that campsite. Ray Evans did the research 30 years ago about the fact that there were punitive raids in order to clear people out of those camps for various reasons in the 1860s.
Do we know any of the reasons?
Well, I haven't done the research for a while, actually. I hadn't had a look at it.
But I just wonder if we could get an answer to why the boundary street, why couldn't they come in after curfew? Why were they being pushed from this York's Hollow? Was it because fear of violence, or was it racism?
With everything in history, there's a combination of factors, and our job is to develop an interpretation that weighs up the evidence and draws out what we see as the driving factors and also the contextual and circumstantial factors. Now, we're getting back to the bigger picture. The story of dispossession means that Aboriginal communities are then marginalised within their own land, and so they are forced, if you like, to the edges. And that's one way to think about it, is that if you're looking to establish a settlement anywhere in colonial Queensland or anywhere in the British-speaking world of the 19th century, the English-speaking world, it's going to involve dispossession and exclusion. And now I don't think it's as simple as saying it's racist. There are racial ideas, but it's also, as I say, this sort of pragmatic approach to, well, what's our business here? We're here to develop the land.
Yeah.
And essentially, the story of impact is also a biological one, in that Europeans brought with them infectious diseases that Aboriginal people had no native immunity to, or no existing immunity to. And on top of that, you've got the disruption of their food supplies, their places of nutrition. So you've got the draining of swamps in the long run. You've got, wallabies being hunted and driven away. You've got vegetation being cut down, So the environmental impacts produces an undermining of Indigenous means of life. And on top of that, you've got the impact of European diseases and also the impact of things like, drink, alcohol, which doesn't exist in traditional culture. So it becomes a rapidly, I was going to say demoralized, but that's a consequence of being fundamentally undermined as an economic and social system. And the end result is that people become antagonized, but also they're on the margins of society, they're excluded from society, and they have to make a living on the edge of that society. And often they end up in shanty towns. Often it's a story of substance and alcohol abuse and so on. There's also a lot of anxiety about interracial marriage and interracial sexual relations. And that gets fired up a lot by 19th century Victorian morality about, what's appropriate in terms of sexual behaviour, but also what's appropriate in interracial relations. There's certainly a lot of racial ideas mixed into that, a lot of racist ideas mixed into that. So the end result is fringe camps, and those fringe camps then become a focus for moral panics about the threat of the fringe camp. Marginalised communities seen as different, somehow threatening.
And so that's why they would have
being pushed
created the separation.
Yeah. So just to get back to Ray Evans's research, he's done a very detailed bit of work on those sorts of tensions in the early settlement and what led up to this riot, this clearance where force was used in order to push people out of these camps.
Yeah.
But there was a number of these camps around Brisbane. The York's Hollow is the most famous of them.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't know any of this. Okay, Geoff, just something a little bit different. Have you ever stumbled on anything in your work historically that has piqued your interest, like a lost letter or a diary?
Well, as it happens, there's a great story developing at the moment with the State Library. A friend and I were at a street market in Woolloongabba in about 2015, And I found amongst the bric-a-brac stall a very small pocket diary, which was written by a woman in Brisbane in 1945. And this is at a time when World War II was still coming to its end. There was an enormous number of American soldiers in Brisbane. She's about 20 years old, and she's loving the fact that there's these glamorous Americans in town. And so she's going to dances with them, and she's writing about it in her diary. So I was looking at this and thinking, wow, this is a really amazing, tiny little pocket diary, one of those ones that you can slide into your top pocket. And it was actually 2 diaries in one, in one envelope. And the first one was her day-to-day record. And it was, strangely enough, it's written in a 1946 diary, but she's overwritten it with the 1945 date. So I think she's transcribed it from something else. Like she might have just kept it in a notebook, but then has put it into an actual diary, because the things she's describing is happening in 1945, but the diary itself is a 1946 diary. So she's overwriting it. But it's very detailed, day by day, and really.
Who's getting rid of this diary?
Well, that's the thing. In fact, I've since made contact with the family. That's exactly right. The person at the market said it had come from a house in Carina, but apart from that, they didn't know anything about it. So I paid $50 for it, along with my friend.
Do we know her name?
Cost. We do now, but that's part of the mystery that I'd like to tell you, because it was detective work to solve it. There's no name on the diary, but it was in my desk. On my desk for a couple of years before I got around to organising some students in one of the courses that I teach to do research on this diary to see if they could find out more about the author. And they worked out that the back piece, tucked inside the back cover, is a little piece of paper. It's sort of pink, and it's obviously from a greeting card or a present, and it says, "To Daphne, love Lola." And so they thought, well, if you've kept that in your diary, you're probably Daphne, right? Because
so you never found that?
I'd seen it as I'd flicked through, but I hadn't gone through the diary at that level of detail. The students did the detailed work. And so they said, well, maybe this person's called Daphne. So they just started calling her Daphne. And they did this research over that semester where they transcribed the contents of the diary, and then each of them wrote about a different aspect of it. So one of them wrote about the Americans, one of them wrote about what it was like to be a young woman, and so on. So these different kind of elements the student projects looked at. Then we donated it to the State Library. And then this year, the State Library was asked by Channel 9 to do a story for Anzac Day on an aspect of their collection that relates to Brisbane's wartime history. And they told Channel 9 about this diary. So it was on the Channel 9 news. We all sort of spoke about it and how it was a lovely, interesting thing. And we don't know who Daphne was, but and since then, people from those families, both Lola's family and Daphne's family, have contacted me and the State Library. And we also had a genealogist volunteer to try and track it down. And so we've now got full connection with everybody. We know that Daphne and Lola were best friends. Lola's brother was killed in the war, and Daphne had a great affection for that brother and was in love with the brother, it seems. And so that isn't mentioned in the diary, but that had happened 2 years earlier. Daphne and Lola were young, were at that stage 19, 20. They'd met at school, and now they were going into the big adventure of being, adults together in Brisbane at a time when Brisbane was going through these enormously historical, significant changes.
A lot of new faces.
Enormous stuff going on.
And then Bruce and Kevin down the road are not happy.
No, that's right. That's right. And Daphne writes about that in a really direct, kind of clear way. It's a very clear voice. She's a 19, 20-year-old woman, and she's writing about it.
Which part? About her experiences at the nightclubs, or about the tension between the Australians and the Americans?
It's all a bit of that, all of the above. But the main thing I get is how clear her voice is. Yeah. She's very direct and authentic in what she's writing about. And so she meets the Americans when she organises a date. The one that she's dating for a while is a guy called Dale, who's I think from California. She writes in her diary how disappointed she is when he turns up drunk again. Oh. So here I'm going to the dance with Dale, and he turns up drunk again. This can't go on, kind of thing. So she's really working through the whole issues of feeling the glamour of these young men, but also the reality of
Also, he's probably seen some action if it's 1945.
Yeah, precisely.
He might be dealing with some PTSD. That's right. He might be just trying to medicate.
Yeah. I think one of the issues is that people often back project our contemporary expectations and understandings. And that's the key thing about history, is you can't assume that the world then is the world now. Now, we've lived in quite a permissive society since the 60s and 70s. To me, there's no evidence whatsoever that there's any kind of sexual liaisons going on. It's not like she's a girl about town or anything who's freely available in that sense. It's basically a 20-year-old going to dances and loving it and writing about it.
And Dale
Dale features a lot. So, and then the fact that she then travels around Australia in 1946, that's in the second diary. And so she's going to different cities and she's traveling on the train. And that's when she's talking about an Australian guy called Clint, who it turns out ends up being her husband. We've had a series of conversations now with Daphne and Clint's daughter, Bill. And so she's coming to the State Library in the next couple of weeks to do a follow-on interview with Channel 9 about that.
What a find.
Yeah, it's great. It's great.
What a find.
And the fact that it's the social history of Brisbane documented through the eyes and the experiences of a 19, 20-year-old who's precisely the same age as our students, which is why the students love it.
Connect.
They
and
totally
can I just say, I've found two books in opportunity shops, shops, and I love that the old ones do have notes and handwritten notes and news article clippings. I even bought a record one time and I know it was Jesus Christ Superstar, the album.
Yeah.
And it was a record, and inside that record was so many clippings at the time of the release. I think it's fascinating. You buy, books from up shops now that are more current. There's nothing inside them.
No. Librarians call that ephemera, and it's a whole category of library holdings. And often the best thing about a collection in an archive or a library, original materials, is that they have the items, but there's also ephemera attached to them. And it might be posters or clippings or programs. And often they're notes or handwritten notes. In the 19th century, people didn't just have books on the bookshelf. They used to read them and they would annotate them. And so a sign of someone who was really reading something is they've written in the margins. We tend to forget that's why there are margins in books, so that people can write stuff in the margin, right, as a note to themselves. Yeah. So it makes it more legible, but it also leaves a spot for you to annotate. And that's a sign of careful, engaged reading if you're annotating something.
Well, there's only one book I've ever done that with, and that's called Big Magic.
Right.
By Elizabeth Gilbert.
Right.
Have you read it?
No, I don't know that one. No.
She also wrote Eat, Pray, Love.
Oh, yes. I know that one.
I did not like that book or that movie, but that's part of the Big Magic book. Is the whole introduction talks about you either hated Eat, Pray, Love,
right,
or you loved it. People were like visceral in their love or hate.
Yeah.
I was the hater.
Yeah.
But this Big Magic, phenomenal.
Yeah.
Highlighted so many just mind-blowing moments in that book. So what did you call the word for it?
It's called ephemera. Well, ephemera is that category of things that aren't really one thing or another. So it's often, little posters or pamphlets or leaflets, things like that get tucked into other things.
What a find.
So,
that's brilliant. So here, if you could time travel to any time in Brisbane's past, when would it be? And
well, I can answer this if you give me a chance to backpedal a bit.
Yeah, love to backpedal.
The archaeologist friend that I mentioned before, Michael Westaway, he and I started a band about 10 years ago. And we wrote a few songs together and we used to play them at barbecues and things. So nothing big. But then, and the name of the band is What Happened in History. And essentially we like to write songs about historical or archaeological subjects. And then we do a sort of a performance. We recorded a few things. Now, when I was doing some research on Brisbane, I was going through a collection at the State Library, which is the clippings book of a guy called Vic Jensen. And if you grew up in Brisbane in the 1980s, you might remember Vic Jensen's shoe.
This podcast is supported by our friends at ActiveFlex, the Australian pain-relieving gel designed for long-lasting relief for painful muscles and joints. Always read the label and follow the directions for use. If your symptoms persist, please seek advice from a healthcare professional. You can shop online at alphasport.com.au and use my special code, BEL10, BEL10. And that's just a little special code for you as a listener of the podcast, using the discount code at alphasport.com.au.
Shops, and there was one at Indooroopilly Shopping Town. I'm pretty sure there was still one in Queen Street. I never knew anything about Vic Jensen until I was going through this clippings file, and it discovered that Vic Jensen was an amateur theatrical performer. So he was a stand-up comedian, he was a singer, and he was a ventriloquist. And I think there's some suggestion that he did kind of, magic tricks and shows and mime acts and things like that. So he's like an all-round entertainer. So I found this clipping.
And he loved shoes.
And he loved shoes. And he had a shop in Queen Street, and he was called Vic Jensen, the Lively Shoe Man, right?
Brilliant.
And he basically was part of his shtick. You know, he had his business, and he was really well known as appearing in amateur theatricals all over the place.
So selling you a shoe and then pulling a rabbit out of the hat.
That sort of thing, you know, that sort of thing. As far as I can't remember the exact details, but I think he was a Danish migrant to start with, but had been in Brisbane since the 1890s. Was very much part of the Brisbane scene. And anyway, in this collection of clippings, I found this amazing playbill advertising an event at the Brisbane Cricket Ground, the Gabba, where they would have this visiting spectacular. They were called the Aerial Dentines, and I think they were like acrobats. And then one of the lines in the playbill was saying, and Mr. Vic Jensen, in a death-defying act, will fly from the top of the stadium to the stage only by his teeth. Right?
How? With what?
On a flying fox.
But
that's my assumption, is because the whole thing was like an acrobatic display. How else would you get from the top of the grandstand?
On a line, and he's holding on by his teeth.
And it says, Mr. Vic Jensen in a death-defying act, right?
Oh, God.
So I found this, well, that's hilarious. That's great.
Funny.
Great. So I
want to see Charlie Cameron come down and start.
Hold on by his teeth. Yeah. So I said this to Michael, and Michael said, it's hilarious. We should write a song. And I went, yeah, okay. So Michael that night.
What's it called?
It's called I Love You, Vic Jensen. And Michael that night came up with the first line, and that is, imagine his wife reading about this in the newspaper. So the song starts with Mrs. Jensen saying how she's reading about this in the newspaper, and all she wants is for him to come back to her and come back to selling shoes, because he's got this dream of being on the stage and being famous and so on. And the whole idea of writing a song about this part of Brisbane history, it really tickles my fancy, you know. And then we've got this nice little sort of arrangement where with the band we write songs and then we record them in different styles.
So I'm just going to list a couple of my favourites. So I have been listening to your music on Spotify.
Very good of you. Thanks,
It's
Bill.
very indie punk rock. It's like 80s.
80s homemade.
I love it. I love it.
Indie.
So some of my favourites is, of course, I Love You, Vic Jensen. That's the song we're discussing now. But the other one that I just love, tell me about the Nunawading by-election.
The Nunawading by-election. Yeah, we had an album. We wanted to release an album with 4 or 5 songs, so like an EP, with a political theme. And because I'd written a song about Andrew Peacock, and I wanted other songs.
Also love that one.
That's a good one.
The Andrew Peacock. It is called Glory Days, Andrew Peacock.
Yeah, that's in fact, some ways that's my favourite song that we've done, because I think it captures a part of political history that people have kind of forgotten. Andrew Peacock was very glamorous in his way, in his particular time.
Yeah.
So we had to do some more political songs. And the Nunawading by-election, when I was about 15, it was in the news all the time. I really don't know why it was in the news. It was in the newspaper. People were talking about it on the radio. So when I had to write a song about a political subject, I thought, let's see what happens with the Nunawading by-election. Turns out that it was a dead heat. The election was a dead heat in a particular seat in the Victorian.
I'd love to know what the polling was.
Yeah, the exact same number of votes, even with preferences factored in and everything, ended up dead heat. Okay. So the returning officer just got a hat and pulled out the names of the 2 possible winners, 2 candidates, pulled their names out and said, right, you're the winner. And so the loser objected. It went to the Court of Disputed Returns.
Flipping a coin.
Yeah, exactly. And so a by-election was held 3 months later, which is why everyone was talking about it, because it had to do with the balance of power in the Victorian Parliament or something. It was a big deal in Victoria. But it echoed, in the national news cycle. And so I remember hearing about it as a 15-year-old. So what I decided to do was to write the song as if it was a Nick Cave murder ballad, right? So if you listen to the song, it's like a guy who was arrested for the death of his wife, the suspicious death of his wife. And all he can remember is the day he's arrested is that this is on the radio and they're saying that it's a dead heat outcome. And the fact that his wife dead and it's a dead heat outcome, it's kind of like the psychology of the guy accused of murder, and then he's in jail. And so the whole thing is like crossing Kerry O'Brien from the 7:30 report with Nick Cave and seeing what the result is, So that's how we do it.
Now, do your students just really get a kick out of this?
I think so. I think they think it's a bit unhinged, but it's a lot of fun. And so I'll write a song. So this semester I'm teaching a British history course.
Yeah.
And we're releasing an album called The Making of the English Working Class, which is a very famous book published in the 60s. And that's a whole lot of songs about the Industrial Revolution.
You would be best lecturer.
I don't know.
People would not tune out.
I hope so. That's the idea is, when you're teaching and when you're lecturing, you've got to try and find the niche, find the zone that's going to work with people. And if that means singing a song, I'm happy to do that.
Okay, Brisbane River. Talk to me about the Brisbane River. There are a couple of different things I've heard. Number one, people think, because it's so brown, you look around other cities, beautiful rivers, and they're clear and you can go on your not city cab, but your boats around it, and it's
Yeah,
gorgeous.
ferries and
The
everything.
ferries are
Yeah.
gorgeous. I'm talking about Sydney Harbour, really. It's
Yeah,
gorgeous.
yeah,
But then you get on a CityCat in Brisbane, although it's a nice ride on the water is brown.
yeah.
So are we talking that it is polluted, or is it
Yeah.
naturally brown?
Well, there's a whole story about that. It's an environmental tragedy, and the truth is it's not polluted. It's a very clean river. I know people talk about the sharks and so on. That's probably a good sign, right? That the marine life is pretty healthy.
Yeah.
It was not that colour until the 1930s, 1940s. And over time, the turbidity, i.e. the solution of silt in the river has built up. And the reason why it was originally not that colour is because originally it has a gravel bed to it. So when the first Europeans came, and during the period of First Nations occupation of Brisbane before the arrival of Europeans, the river is a superb, clear, fresh-flowing river. It doesn't have a tidal change the way it does now. So in the early 19th century, the tide only came up as far as Hamilton.
Okay. Yeah.
Now the tide goes up as far as Colleges Crossing.
Yeah.
So the water is brackish and saline all the way up. It's a combination of fresh and salt water, essentially. But what's fundamentally happened is that the availability of gravel on the riverbed, which was the reason why it was such a clear and attractive stream, is that it's a big, very powerful river.
You could swim in it.
You could swim in it. You could
drink
certainly drink the water. There were public baths at Mowbray Park. There were public baths at South Brisbane. They used to have swimming competitions at the dry dock, in the South Brisbane dry dock. They just let the river water in and people would swim, school competitions and so on. So I did some research for the consultancy that I worked for in the late 1990s at a time when dredging on the Brisbane River was being wrapped up and essentially banned. And that research was fascinating because I wrote an environmental history of the river using a lot of other people's work who'd written on the history of the river, but compiling it all together and developing an understanding of how the natural environmental characteristics of the river had been fundamentally altered by dredging.
Yeah.
And it's not just navigation dredging for ships at the mouth of the river. It's the extraction of gravel all the way up and down the river.
So dredging is what? This big machine
bucket goes in,
drags at the bottom of the river.
Yeah, it's a big bucket and it just scoops up everything on the bed of the river and dumps it on board the barge.
And then who made the money out of the gravel?
Well, that's essentially an industry. By that time it was being run by Boral, but it was a whole series of dredge operators who would then sell the gravel to
But what about the fact that no one owned the river? How could they make money out of it? How could businesses be allowed to make money?
They were given a lease to conduct dredging operations, a permit essentially to conduct dredging operations. So the council and the government, well, policymakers would, because it's fundamentally changed the structure of the river.
Yeah.
It means the river will never be clear because it no longer has a base. So the siltation that comes down, the sediments that run off into the river now just form,
And they coming from Colleges Crossing?
Well, anything that flows into the river brings surface soil and, rainfall and drainage, outflow into the river.
But you're saying it's clean. So if
the river itself is clean.
Accidentally gulped a little.
Yeah, you'd be fine.
You'd be fine.
Yeah.
And as you say, they do tests on it and it's actually.
Yeah, it's not pollution.
There's marine life in there.
Yeah.
Is there a whole ton of bull sharks?
Well, there's apparently quite a lot. People say they see them all the time. But that's because the river, the natural contours of the river have been dredged out in order to, A, remove the gravel, but also B, to allow navigation in the lower reaches.
Yeah.
And so they cut off the tips of the points. So, for instance, Kangaroo Point, New Farm Point, they've actually cut back to make it possible for ships to turn around those, And that goes back to the whole story of Brisbane as a colonial city, because any epicenter of colonial development and settlement anywhere in the British Empire had to be connected by ship, by boat. And so Sydney on Sydney Harbour, Melbourne on Port Phillip and so on. You've got these nodes of British colonisation all around the world linked by the sea. And so Brisbane is established on Moreton Bay, but it doesn't have a harbour on Moreton Bay. Gladstone has a far better natural harbour than Brisbane would ever have. So essentially they had to turn the river into a harbour, so there was wharves all up and down the main reaches of the inner city. Petrie Bight, South Brisbane, they had, wharves and warehouses and so on. And so that's the excavation of the navigation channels downstream from there was to enable, significantly sized ships to come all the way up the river in order to dock, in the CBD. Because Brisbane simply had to have a port. And so they've engineered a port here because there is no natural harbour.
Yeah. Oh, and what about the Indigenous uh, people back in the day with the colonization? Well, before colonization, shall I say? With what were they using the river for, and what did it mean to them, the Brisbane
Yeah,
River?
yeah. Known as Maiwa. So people talk about the traditional name of the Brisbane River is simply Maiwa.
Mm.
And it is a living entity in cultural terms, but it's also a living entity in everyday life. It's something that you use for sources of food. It's something they would use for, for recreation, for swimming and so on. There was also points on the river where the water was shallow and there were kind of like, not rapids, but it was just shallower. So Carulpa Point is one of those areas, and it's described in the early historical records as being a place where you could literally cross from one side of the river to the other because it's shallower.
At Karupa.
Yeah, at Carulpa. And I'm not saying it's like ankle deep or anything,
No.
but it's just
But
shallows.
you could get
You
across.
get shallows and you get across.
Yeah.
So there's certain
With the tide.
points. Yeah, that's right. Although the tide didn't come up that far at that stage. So it's still a fresh river going the other way. So that's where the environmental parameters are really quite interesting. The original river is really nothing like what we experience today. But in terms of the Indigenous presence and the Indigenous use of the site and the elements in the river, it's clearly at the very core of social life and at the very core of people's kind of spiritual connection with the area, because it's a magnificent river. If you go up and down the east coast of Australia, it's really quite magnificent. It's very broad. It's it's deep. It's got beautiful sort of fresh water in that period, and so that's why it is such a seen as an opportunity for colonial settlement and development. Is the river itself is a guarantee of future economic activity, of farming and water supply and so on. That's why Carulpa Point is so significant, and also we now think of as Gardens Point and other points on both sides of the river, where the kind of the landmarks and the evidence of Indigenous occupation and the naming of those places in Indigenous tradition is there in those early records. I think one of the best things about history is anyone can do it. Anyone can have a sense of it, and anyone can have curiosity about it. So I think what we're trying to do with our students, and what I always say to people thinking about history, is that it's around us, and you just have to scratch the surface and follow your curiosity. And that's what libraries are for. That's what archives and museums and galleries are for. That if you've got an interest, just explore it, and it broadens your horizons. It broadens your kind of sense of connection to what's gone before, and you can find answers to questions you're curious about. So it's really not something that's just done by specialists. It's something that if you're curious about where you live or where you come from or the kind of society you inhabit, why we do things the way we do, where our ideas come from, where our institutions and habits come from.
And I've always had a fascination with Queenslanders. And I've found on the archives, you would know the name of the photographer who went around Brisbane. Do you know his name?
Yeah, I know the one you mean. Yeah, I can't remember his name. Yeah, there's an archive of.
Yeah, you just Google it if you're listening now. If you've got a Queenslander and you wanted to see a photo of it in like the 40s or 50s.
They worked for a real estate company and they photographed
he drove
every
around
house.
all of Brisbane. Pretty sure it was Redcliffe too, and photographed every house he saw. And then his wife would drive the car. He would hang out the window photographing the houses, and then he would sell the picture of the house to the homeowner. Now, when he passed away, I think one of his children found the archive in the house, gave it to the museum.
To the John Oxley Library, I think.
The John Oxley Library.
Or is it the Queensland? Sorry, it's the City Council. I can't remember. It's one of the two. But they've digitized.
I think
they've digitized it. Yeah,
they've digitized it, and now I can put my address in online and find this beautiful photo of my home back in this old date. But the point of me talking to you about this, when I bought this house, it was built in 1936. Now, homes back then, I understand from research, were bought as like IKEA kit homes. So you and your mates would build the house. You wouldn't have a home builder. There was nobody to do it. So you would hire people that were your mates or your family, and you would build the house as a kit together. I cannot find with this particular house the brand or the plan online. If your students ever want to do that,
some house research.
Do some house research. Because I'm sure this house was built 1,000 times. The same kit. But I cannot find it.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. That these the style we think of as the Queenslander was like there
are so many
styles. Variations on a particular
There's
model.
Bungalows, colonial.
Porch and gable and so on. Yeah, all those different styles. My predecessor at the University of Queensland, Dr. Rod Fisher, he did an enormous amount of work with the Brisbane History Group, looking at the history of Brisbane, but also particularly, the development of suburbs and of areas and of, neighbourhoods and places with particular identities. And this whole notion of how the housing gives character to the city. And I think one of the really interesting ideas is how in Brisbane, with the hilly topography, one researcher, Ronald Lawson, called it segregation by topography. So the posh houses are on the top of the hill and the working class houses are in the gullies. And that's partly because bigger houses, top of the hill, nice outlook, but also 19th century ideas about health, and that if you were in an airy place that was well circulated by breezes, you wouldn't suffer from things like malaria, which was believed to be carried by the air.
Yeah.
Now, the fact that mosquitoes tend to, be found in low-lying, watery, wet areas kind of gives some specious support to this. It's not really actually spread by the air, but the fact that if you're living in a gully where it's close to a swamp, you're going to find more mosquito. That's right. So this whole notion of, and you can see
they do get sprayed by council, by the way.
You can see it right now if you go around Brisbane. The bigger houses are on the top of the hills and the tops of the hills. And the smaller cottages, the more modest cottages, are the ones built as kind of housing, affordable housing for working class communities. They're all in the gullies, or outside.
Okay, now Geoff, very last question for you. Now I'm asking all of my guests on Once Upon a Real Life this question: have you ever seen a ghost or a UFO?
Funnily enough, I haven't seen a UFO, but I haven't myself seen a ghost, but I did some research on a guy called John Ward, who was a spiritualist, and he felt he was clairvoyant. And so he's a really interesting guy. I wrote a book about him. He established a religious community in the UK, and that religious community came to Australia in the 1950s after his death. And they now live up at the Abbey Museum at Caboolture. So that Abbey Museum that people know for the medieval tournament and so on is associated with the teachings of John Ward, who is a spiritualist and a Freemason and a clairvoyant, and really interesting ideas, very interesting spiritual guy. So as a result of researching his life, I became more open to the idea of spiritual continuity, the idea that human beings are a form of energy, and that form of energy, as we know, energy can change forms, can go from one to another, and that the idea of the survival of the personality after death is really just a form of energy transference, and that's potentially quite conceivable. So I was open to the idea of spiritual connections with the way the spiritualist movement had always said could be possible. And then I was in the UK and doing some research for the Abbey Museum people by going to a pub in Staffordshire, I think it was, where they wanted to replicate that pub at the Abbey Museum in Brisbane because they want to build a medieval village, and there's a medieval pub in this county in England. And so I was there taking photographs of it and also taking measurements. And because I'm fairly open-minded about this whole idea of our spiritual, continuity, and also the thought that that's potentially what ghosts are, people who've become disembodied and they're, for whatever reason, they're lingering, in the nooks and crannies of everyday life. Energies and so on. And the people in the pub were absolutely convinced that there was a ghost in the pub. And the guy said, yeah, it's just all the time. We go to, when the guy locks up to go upstairs, there's strange, noises around, and they just know it's the ghost going to bed, and so on. He said, and it's often in the fire. And he pulled out his phone. Now, he's got no reason to fib to me about this, and he's got no reason to expect that I'm going to publicise it or anything. But he said, yeah, look, this was last week. And he showed me on his phone, and there it is. Just a face in the fire. That's what it is. And it wasn't just a face in the fire. It was literally a face, in the fire. And it's multiple photographs of a person whose facial features are being created by the flames. No, he just had it on his phone. So he said, we're going to use this to try and promote the pub at some stage in the future. So I think in the long run, they wanted to do something with this idea. But to me, people talk about spirit photography, people talk about taking photographs of ghosts and so on.
Orbs, things like that.
Yeah. This was, I was measuring the place to maybe, build a version of it in Australia with the Abbey Museum. This is literally just a guy who the next day was showing me around town sort of thing. And I thought, yeah,
that's plausible.
That's plausible, exactly. And I'm not saying I'm convinced or that I've been, hoaxed or anything. I'm not saying one way or the other, but I just think there's no reason to sort of assume that.
So I would say
right.
that your story pushes my stats to about 60-40 have seen a ghost.
Yeah.
Only 7%, roughly,
yeah,
have seen a UFO.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
The ghosts.
The ghosts. And I think it does relate back to what you're receptive to and what you're open to and what you're prepared. And if you've got a materialistic assumption about life, therefore, by definition, you're not open to it. So therefore, you're not suggestible in a way. Now,
it would have to be a really powerful ghost to get through to you in that case.
So I'm not saying,
or an angry one.
I think I would have described myself as an atheist when I was younger. I would now describe myself as an agnostic, in the sense that I don't really know. But I also believe that the religious systems of the world all pretty much have common emphasis on the idea of spiritual growth, and the idea of you are living this life in order to achieve a form of spiritual growth, and that spiritual growth doesn't end with your bodily demise.
Do you think your life is written?
What does that mean?
So some say, based on what you just said, some say, and I've read books about this, that you choose the life you're going to lead. So, and then reincarnation, and you choose the next one, and you choose.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
You're saying, do you think that it's written?
No,
or do
I
you think everything is?
I haven't gone so far into it in order to be persuaded by one view or another.
But reincarnation?
I'm comfortable with the idea of reincarnation. I'm comfortable with the idea of there being a spiritual journey, a spiritual progression, and that occurs across multiple incarnations. That's certainly what a very large proportion of the world believes. That's a fundamental to Hinduism and Buddhism.
Absolutely.
It's also, a kind of fundamental principle in the idea of ethical conduct, and the idea of there being a long-term justice involved, and that human goodness and human compassion is part of the process of self-perfection. And that's an idea that exists in virtually every religious tradition we might want to point to.
How was it for you? I know that you've written books. We'll actually get you to mention your books too, but this archaeologist and archangels, archangels and archaeologists. This is a book you wrote.
That's my biography of John Ward, who's the guy that I mentioned before.
Right. So when you wrote about religion, in Queensland,
you can say a bit more about that.
What I will ask you is how was it for you writing about religion when your belief is not there?
Yeah. That's the job of the scholar, the researcher. We don't necessarily write about things just because we believe they're true. We write about things because, we're interested in them, or we're curious about them, or that there is a factual basis that we can work through in an analytical sense in order to answer the questions that we think are important. So I worked with the Abbey Museum for a number of years, and the Abbey Church, which is attached to the Abbey Museum, developed a great relationship with them, and became really intrigued by the story of how their founder established this religious community in London in the 1920s and 1930s. And that's the story of John Ward. So that first book of mine called Archangels and Archaeology is a biography of John Ward. And he's essentially comes out of that English colonial context that I was talking about before. So he's born in Belize in British Honduras. He comes back to London as a child. His father is an Anglican clergyman, so he grows up in a very conventional London middle-class home. But over time, he becomes more interested in other traditions and other spiritual traditions. He's interested in history. He's interested in ethnography and comparative culture. And so he's a very curious, interested guy. So when he's at Cambridge studying history, which is again another thing that I find an affinity with him, he becomes a Freemason, and he's fascinated by Freemasonry as a survival of ancient belief systems. He thinks of Freemasonry as a survival of initiation rites associated with early religious beliefs. Most other people don't think that Freemasonry is that, but
I'm going to do a deep dive on
Freemasonry. Is fascinating. It's like an 18th century Age of Enlightenment conceit where they kind of
they want to believe in something.
They want to believe in something, and so they want to create a system whereby you can have ritual, you can have symbolism, you can participate in these things, but you can do it once a month with a bunch of other blokes without your wives and girlfriends. You're basically men getting together to have a meal and sort of talk and work your way through. I think it's a highly sociable vehicle, but it also has an age.
Like a man shed.
It's definitely like a man shed. It belongs in the history of what we might think of as homo sociability, how men socially relate to each other.
And that's important.
And that's very important.
Completely important.
Yeah. So but it also comes out of the late 17th, early 18th century idea of there being a kind of a set of principles underpinning everything. It's a philosophical approach to say, well, the world is rational and the world is organized according to principles. And the idea of Freemasonry is that it talks about God as the architect of the universe, and that we are.
Is it God with Jesus the Son?
No, it's not explicitly Trinitarian in that sense. It's not explicitly. It's more talking about and kind of what we think of as an interfaith tradition of God as a creative spirit embodying everything.
Right.
Yeah, and the different religious
The
traditions.
creator, not necessarily God, the Father of Jesus,
No, that's
who
right.
had Mary
That's right.
and the 12 disciples.
Yeah, so
there's no disciples in Freemasonry.
No. Freemasonry doesn't talk about an explicit revelation like that. And that's the reason why the Catholic Church in particular
don't enjoy the Freemasons.
No, they don't. And they excommunicate people who are Catholics who are also Freemasons.
Oh,
so it's officially banned.
There are so many excommunications.
You can't be a Catholic and a Freemason.
You could be excommunicated for.
But you can also be a Buddhist or a Muslim or an Anglican or a Protestant or whatever, So apart from Catholicism, So Freemasonry's got a really interesting social history, but it develops across the world really hand in hand with British colonial expansion. Because if you're a naval captain or a military officer or a insurance agent or a broker or something, and you arrive in somewhere like, I don't know, Siam in the 1860s, you link up with other Freemasons, right? And so it gives you a chance to meet other people who are also involved in this colonial process. Business networks, social connections.
And that often shed vibes for sure. I love it.
Yeah.
Now,
anyway, that's a long story about John Ward. So he's also a spiritualist as well as being a Freemason, and that kind of interest in different religious traditions with an underlying emphasis on spirituality that comes through from John Ward, loud and clear. And so writing that biography was a great opportunity to explore some of those religious themes through his life.
I can see why he wanted to create that. I'm going to call it religion. Does he call it a religion?
Because he's an Anglican who fundamentally he's an Anglican who can see the spiritual potential of the idea of reincarnation.
Right.
So no Anglican believes in reincarnation officially.
Right.
That's the idea. The Anglican Church doesn't talk about that. Yeah. So he's trying to fuse different ideas. So it's syncretistic. He's sort of synthesizing different elements.
Yeah.
And so he's what we call a new religious movement, an NRM, a new religious movement, because it develops coming out of these traditions of older religions, but it's like a fusion between these different elements. And so he's interested in Buddhism and Hinduism. He's interested in what he describes as an Indian tradition of spiritual esoteric knowledge. And he thinks that underpins a lot of other religious traditions around the world. And so to his followers, because he essentially gives public lectures in London and people come and join him, and they establish a neo-medieval monastery for men and women in North London in 1930. And they also set up their own museum as part of that, because he's a lifelong collector of antiquities. This is the Abbey Museum. So the story of the Abbey Museum goes back to this very interesting moment in religious history in England, because he's not a major figure. Like, he's not well known in the UK, but his Abbey Museum, the first version of it in London, is hugely successful, very, very popular, because it's a cutting-edge idea of history as an immersion. You go there and you can see reconstructed buildings and you can see the artifacts on display in their original setting, and you can pick things up and you can hold them and you can do dress-ups and you can... So the whole idea of a living history museum, he pioneers that idea in the 1930s. That's why he's
and I can see a place for a religion like that in the fact that I've often thought, because I am a Catholic, I would definitely tick the box of being a Catholic when I get my census, but I don't attend church. I used to attend church. I used to love it. The things that I loved was the community. It was the people.
Yep.
It was the songs and the music.
It's meaningful. Yeah.
It was meaningful.
Yeah.
But I didn't necessarily need the context of the Bible.
Yeah.
Those are the other things that I wanted. And then I often think to myself, why isn't there somewhere like that that we can all go to once a week, be together for the greater good, that doesn't have to rely on something some guy or four guys wrote.
And a bunch of beliefs that I need to sign up for.
Right.
Yeah.
And as a female, it feels too heavy.
Yeah. I've got colleagues at the University of Queensland who work in the Studies in Religion program, and they and I, my colleague Adam Bowles in particular, we got together about 5 years ago and developed an idea around a Queensland Atlas of Religion, looking at all the different religious traditions that are currently represented in Queensland life. And that's exactly what you say, that kind of embodying community and having something that people participate in and having something that's meaningful, that's often joyful and affirming. That's what religion does for communities all the time.
Love that part of it.
And there's a whole theological element that often people are either skeptical about or are resistant to. And that doesn't need to be how you define religion. You don't define religion through a set of ideas, a doctrine or a dogma. And that's how we've fallen into the habit as a society of thinking that that's what religion is.
Yeah.
But what you're describing is what religion really is for most people. And there's one scholar who describes that as...
I feel like it's in a box. I'm in a box.
Yeah.
And I can't get out of it. And then, like, I
Yeah.
remember being at mass one time and the priest was talking. He was reading. And what he was reading, basically, I'm just going to put it into my own context, was that as a female and as a wife, you need to submit to your husband in all areas, so even in the bedroom. And I remember looking at my girlfriend going, are they still reading this right now?
Yeah,
and then she turns around and her brother-in-law is at the back of the church, like looking at us and laughing and like gyrating because it's so ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's so ridiculous.
It's now no longer in alignment with what people's expectations with their lives would be. Yeah.
And it just felt like, did we just jump back in time?
Yeah.
100 years?
Yeah. Like any human institution, religions have to evolve, and they are all the time. And some religions hold on to an idea of orthodoxy or an idea of this is how it should be. And that in itself can produce tensions and conflicts and so on. But what we see in the big picture is communities coming together for all the reasons that you said. And in a way, it's to satisfy all those basic human needs about fellowship and about...
fellowship's a fantastic word for it.
Yeah, and about, aligning around common goals, around it is about teamwork. It's about celebration. And when that can occur, it's very meaningful for people.
Yeah.
And what we've found is that Australia is by no means a secular place, and Australia is by no means becoming more secular. In fact, quite the opposite. As soon as you experience the community life of all of these different faith traditions. And so we've got articles about Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Chinese religion, Anglicanism, the Methodist Church, the Uniting Church,
Baptist,
Catholic Church, Baptist,
Pentecostal.
Quakers, the Pentecostals.
See, Quakers I want to learn more about. Is that in the book?
There's a Quaker. There's a Quaker house in Brisbane, and we'd like to do an entry on that. And we've got a person who can potentially write about significant Quakers in the past, because they're often pacifists. They're often into civil disobedience campaigns around moral issues, things that they think are really important. So, for instance, anti-war.
Yeah.
We all need a dose of Quaker, conviction from time to time.
And then Pentecostal's my favourite.
Yeah. Well, we've got a fantastic PhD student, Gerald Caparis, who's finished his PhD on Pentecostalism in Brisbane, and he's basically talking about how what we think of as charismatic or Pentecostal church, so the Hillsong being the most famous example, is a form of mediated participation in the idea of direct contact with the Word of God, right? So that the idea that you are energized by the Spirit of God as much as by the Word of God is a really powerful idea in Pentecostalism.
Lame in the Spirit.
Yeah, and he's talking...
Drunk in the Spirit.
Well, this is speaking in tongues. The idea of Pentecostal literally means when the Holy Spirit descends and is then given expression.
I talked about this in one of my other episodes, but I went to a Pentecostal mass when I was 18. My flatmate and I was Catholic, she was Pentecostal, neither of us were practicing.
Yeah.
But then we got into this argument about my church is better than yours for no reason at all.
Because you're 18. Yeah.
Because you're 18.
Yeah.
And then she's like, well, I'll go to yours, you go to mine. I'm like, great. She comes to mine, Catholic. She's like, this is so boring.
Yeah.
And then she's like, okay, come to mine. We went to hers the next weekend.
Great thing for 18-year-olds to do.
I got I was not a practicing Catholic at that point. So it was just, I was trying to, I don't know what I was trying to do.
Right? It's ethnography. You're checking it out. Yeah.
And so I go to her church. I get a free milkshake for going. It is crazy fun.
Yep.
Band on stage.
Yep.
Rocking out. Everyone's drunk in the Spirit, rolling around the floor, literally with the feeling of God flowing and pumping through their brains.
That's right. Being open to that.
Yeah. The pastor was talking in tongues to people and calling people to the stage that were ill. And I'm like, I'm ill.
Yeah.
Put my hand up. I went up there and he's doing the old speaking in tongues to my face. Got his hand above my head here, speaking in tongues, healing me.
Yeah.
And I'm supposed to fall back and people are supposed to catch me, lie me on the floor like everyone else is, and I stay there.
Yeah.
But I didn't fall back. And then he pushed me.
Right. And so you took the suggestion, now's the time to fall over.
Go down.
Yeah.
And so then these two people caught me and then I felt the pressure to stay on the floor.
Yeah.
But it was such an entertaining, fun experience.
Well, this is precisely what Gerald's written about in the entry. So we've produced this Queensland Atlas of Religion. It's an online public reference website. You search for it online and it's there. and it's got entries on all these different faith traditions in Queensland. And Gerald wrote an entry on this style of Christianity, which he calls cool Christianity or contemporary
Oh,
Christianity.
there is definitely cool.
Yeah.
And there is definitely contemporary.
Yeah, and it's about how it's mediated through the presence of the band, the sound,
Mm-hmm.
the participation in the singing, the lighting, the smoke effects, the whole atmosphere that's generated. And so it's like that. We're not in any way disrespecting that tradition,
No.
but we're underlining how, or analysing and thinking about how that tradition is mediated through technology and performance.
Mm.
And that's a really interesting thing to think about, is how different religious traditions are manifested as a experience for people, as a
100%.
Sensation for people.
What about river life? What type of religion are they?
I actually don't know, to be honest.
There's a beautiful River Life church around the corner here, up at 17 Mile Rocks.
Yep.
And it's like you're walking into Boondall. Like it.
Yeah, it would come from the same Protestant tradition. Yeah, so there's a kind of a Pentecostal.
Beautiful music.
Yeah.
Like it is
there's a Pentecostal charismatic tradition where these sorts of things
they don't do the slain in the spirit or the tongue, so I don't think
so
it's
there might be a moderated version of it.
But it is fantastic.
Yeah.
The music, the stage, the lighting, the youth.
Yeah.
They've got a basketball court for the youth.
Yeah.
Pool tables. They've got it's incredible.
Yeah. So a lot of these churches come out of a tradition that we might think of as American Protestant evangelism, evangelical. So it's the idea that everyone has access to the Word of God. Everyone has access to the love of Jesus. Everyone has access to be reborn. So to be reborn, to be a born again Christian through direct experience of the love of Jesus and the forgiveness that comes with that. These are really powerful ideas that inspire people and energize them and lead to life transforming experiences. Now, there's a negative side to that as well as a positive side, and we're not shying away from.
I'm thinking of some negatives now with what you just said too.
Yeah, true.
But that's my personal opinion.
Yeah,
and I guess when you're indoctrinated to something that you didn't choose, I grew up as a Catholic, and I know there was a reason our family kind of held on to that because we needed it at the time. And when I went back and as an adult, I needed it at the time. But there's a place for religion, absolutely, in people's lives. And there's also some choices you make, whether you participate or not, and what part of it you want to participate in.
I think I've come to basically a humble position. Who am I to say that I know the answer and that God cannot exist, therefore I'm an atheist?
Yeah.
I'm not so arrogant as to say that. I'm actually looking at the great variety of human experience, all these cultural traditions, all of these ethnicities and language traditions all around the world all speak to a similar idea about the spiritual element in our lives. And who am I to say that that's a fiction?
Yeah.
I don't think it's a
fiction.
Let's
just be good people.
Yeah.
Let's just be great people and create community that's welcoming.
Yeah.
That's what I want to see.
Let's be curious and engaged, and let's be respectful of others.
Yeah.
And let's take an interest in the culture that we're a part of, where it comes from, and what that means in the present, and how we can make it fairer, more just and safer.
Well, Geoff, you are a legend. Thank you so much for coming and chatting with me today. We just talked and chewed the fat on so many different topics.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to make a list for the description of this episode, what it's about.
Happy to, yeah.
You are a legend. Thank you so much for coming today.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Real Life with Belle, and for choosing conversations that are honest, real, and sometimes uncomfortable. If you loved this episode, please follow, subscribe, and leave a review so the stories can keep being shared. Until next time, stay true to yourself, never settle for less, and keep choosing real life, even if it's hard.